Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of skyrocketing your backend development with Strapi CMS. Today we're going to pick up where we left off, and that is to how do we data validate, how do we identify a user when they've been authenticated, and also we're going to dive in a little bit deeper on how some of this functionality works behind the scenes and when to use each one of them. All right. Let's get cracking. So I hope you're ready. I'm ready. I've got my fresh cup of coffee right here. Let's do this. And that's my inner Matthew McConaughey channeling through the channel here. Anywho.
Awkward.
Let's get this rolling. For our next set of steps, we do need to create a couple of users. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to start Strapi by running npm run and develop. And then as soon as that starts, it's taking a little bit long. Here we go. Okay, perfect. I've got my window already open, so let's just refresh that to make sure that it's working. Perfect. And you can see that currently there are no users. The way that we're going to register our users is by using Postman. And let me just move that out of the way. Jumping the gun here. I was testing it before doing the actual cast itself, but let me just start from scratch. Here we're going to use Postman, and we use a post method, and our body is going to be the username, a phone number, email, password, and I want to enable it right away as soon as they're created. Now, I have seen a few posts on Strapi forum and Stack Overflow and what have you about the ability to use phone numbers as a login. The answer is yes. In fact, we've done a couple of projects where the phone number is the login and essentially the authenticator, along with the ability to reset a password using the phone number and also the email. So there's two ways to then re-authenticate a user should they forget their password. So let's just register the user with the phone number. And I've just re-registered that user, and you can see that it's come back successfully, and the record ID is 6. If we refresh that over here, it should then show up as a user. And you can see that the phone number is there, email confirmed is true, and it has been assigned as a default to the authenticated role. Okay, now that we've got that, we want to be able to log in with this user. So if we go over here, again, just ignore that little bit there. I was testing it prior to this. I then want to be able to log in, and we're going to use the phone number as the identifier and then the password as created. And let's log in. And that generates us a new JWT token, which is right there. And we get the credentials. Okay, so at the moment, the provider is local because it is using the Strapi authenticator. Perfect. Let's go and see how we can then start using validation on our content types. Okay, so before we move into the validation side of things, you may have noticed that I did remove the address content type.
Yes, you noticed, huh?
And that's so that we can all be on the same page as we walk through the scenarios that we're building. What we're going to do is create a new content type called address. Now, from a realistic application perspective, most applications will require you to have one or more addresses per customers, depending on your industry. And this will demonstrate further on down the track on how this will come into play. So let's start with the first entry, and let's just call this address 1. Very quickly, we're going to work with just a short text for now. And on our last field here, we're going to use a relational field. And let's go to the user plugin and the many to one. So what we're doing here is we're saying that a user can essentially have many addresses assigned to them. And again, from a real scenario perspective, it covers just that particular area. So let's just say this, finish. And the way that this is going to work is that when we submit an address entry with the validated user, we're going to be automatically picking up that user ID and assigning it to the record creation, all in one go. Let's click Save. And now let's go to the content manager side of things. Okay, so now let's validate that our new content type of address, it is indeed working as expected. So let's just say one something straight. I'm going to leave line 2 empty. This will be 2000 New South Wales, Australia, and the relationship will be a list of users, in this case a user, which we created earlier, and select that, save. Now, just a quick note, with this user, you wouldn't want to be doing this manually from the backend. This would be a utility that you create from a front-end point of view to then be able to filter accordingly. But this is purely from an API perspective and test our functionality. So that's saved successfully. Now we're going to validate that by going back to our entries. We can see that it's in here with that user. Perfect. I'm going to delete that now. And this is going to be recreated through our API endpoint. So in this case, we've got API addresses. So let me just make sure that I have indeed enabled that role, authenticated, as only users who have been authenticated can access that, and that is enabled. Now, when we submit this entry for that address that we've just tested manually, we're going to see an error as below. So if that, there you go, we see an error. Now, the reason why we see this error is that Strapi by default, when creating an API endpoint, it creates an empty core-router config. And the way that we then facilitate the CRUD functions, such as create, find, update, delete, and find one, for that router config is by manually telling the router what we want it to do. So, and that's what we're going to look at now. And the way that we extend that is by adding the config to that call router. And in this case, on the config, we want to say enable create, and how that will then create the record is by using, in this example, we're going to use middleware. And we haven't actually created a middleware yet, so let's do that now. Just to reiterate over that, so we're going to create a middleware that will handle the request to the create functionality on our config to then execute the insert into the database. So let's go here and say npx strapi generate. All right, so we want to create a middleware. And we're going to call this, what do I want to call this? Let me have a look. Yeah, just call this address. Double check this because I did recreate this earlier. Address create. Perfect. And we're going to add this to an existing API, which is our address. Perfect. So now under our address API, we've got middlewares, and we see that we've got the middleware in here. So if we were to execute that, and we will do this by the way that we bring that in is by telling it that our middleware is under our API address, which is this, and the name of the middleware is address/create. All right, so let's save this, and let's very quickly test what that looks like from an API submission point of view. Okay, so while that's running, let me just double check that we've got the right data submitted. Okay, so that's up and running. Let's submit to our API address endpoint and see what it does. Okay, so it still tells us that there's an error. That was expected. And in here, I was expecting to see the address middleware, which is right here. Perfect. So now let's add the insert functionality onto this middleware so that we can actually get some data in there.
Show me the money!
Okay, so to modify the middleware data code, I'm going to replace it with my written code that I've tested with earlier. and we're going to look at that in detail. So let me just put that over here. What we're going to do is we're going to pass the data by calling it from the middleware. And this is our middleware right here. From there, we have access to the CTX body, in this case, the actual request that we're sending through. And I'm going to assign the user as per the state of the authenticated user in here. And don't worry, we're going to dive into this deeper a bit down the track. And I'm going to assign a published ad with a new date so that it becomes available right away in case the user needs to access it in real time. And in here, you'll notice that we're using the strapi entity service. So this is a layer removed from the DB query. By all instances, it does an awesome job, and you should try to take advantage of this as much as you can, as it provides some really nice utilities out of the box, and we're going to see that in play next. But for now, let's just very quickly see what this does. Save that. And I'm going to submit this record, and I should see a successful response. Perfect. We go back to our data, refresh this. And then we see our data entered as expected. Perfect. Okay, so now let's dive into the data validation that comes out of the box when using the entity service within Strapi.
I fear you're underestimating the sneakiness, sir.
Okay, let's navigate to the content type in order to understand what's going on here. So out of the box, from the admin panel, we are somewhat spoiled in how we achieve the data validation. And what do I mean by that? Is if we go to that field that we're working with, in this case, address 1, I've pre-selected this to be a required field, and I've given it a regex inside the admin panel to not accept any entries for this field where there's a full stop somewhere in the code, in the text. So let me just quickly test this. And I'm going to say that line 1 is a null value. Submit that, and it tells me that it is a required field, and it cannot be of null value, and it also tells us the type, and we're going to check that out very soon. Now, if I put the address back in here, and let's just say I put a dot at the end of this, it then tells me that it must match the actual regex, and we can write some code to handle that from a user response point of view. But that data validation is straight out of the box under advanced settings. Now, can you get niftier with this? Yes. Let's just say, for example, I want, in this case, I've already played with this, and I've given address 2 to be a required field and be a maximum of 5 only and a minimum of 1 character. So let's test that out by going into here, submit, 2 errors occurred, and we can then extrapolate what those errors are by handling the mechanics from the code. It tells me that address 2 is at least 1 character, say 1, 2. And then that went through. If we try to do more than that, it comes back with an error of at least 5 characters. So if we get rid of that, we see that the entry goes through. Let's verify that by going in here. We see that that data is now in. Now, can we achieve some validation that requires more manual config? Yes, we can, and we're going to look at that next.
I'm going deep undercover.
Okay, so before we go into how do we validate manually for field entries, let's quickly close the chapter on the entity service. Entity service within Strapi automatically picks up the schema in question under our router. So this is the core router for the Strapi address endpoint. And then that handles the validation for the schema that we have created through the definition For example, on address 1, we said that it was a required field with no dots allowed in there. Address 2, for example, we said that it's a minimum of 1 character, maximum of 5, and it's also a required field. So utilizing the strapi through the core config provides great benefits and enables you to move quickly, specifically when you're working with that one functionality only. Can you extend this to other content types? The answer is yes, but it's much cleaner if you keep the entity service tied to that particular content type. The manual validation side of things comes into play for our custom routers, which we're going to jump into next. And there, some of the functionality that comes out of the box for the strapi entity service are no longer available by automatically bringing in that data validation. So let's go to the next chapter of manual routers and controllers. Right, so let's jump in here and look at how we do custom routers and how we handle the validation for those. First of all, we're going to create a new content type, and let's call this order. Okay, and let's just say that we're going to have a description field of description. Let's say let's go to number to call this the quantity field. Format type integer. Let's have a product code. So product code. And let's add a relational field so that we keep it relevant to what we've been working with so far. So in this case, we're going to say a user can have many orders. So in this case, boom, boom, there you go. All right. And once again, we're going to test this content type.
This son of bitch almighty check.
By very quickly going into the admin panel, create an entry, just call it 21 product code. Let's call this, assign that to the user, save, retest, all good. Now we're going to delete this because we want to create this from the API. All right, so if we go into our API code, we see that we have our new API of order. Under that route, we see that it's got the default call router to then add the config if you wanted to. But in this case, we're going to extend this to work as a custom router so that we can create a number of different functions within that controller. And this will give us a lot more power, and it's also a lot more granular in how we are going to play and interact with the database by being able to filter. And this become quite essential from a performance point of view, as that more granularity provides you more control and more performant outcomes. Okay, so how do we change this? I've pre-created some code. And if you recall from our first video, when we create a new API, we get this default code given to us. And this is going to be a default. And so that's expected. It's crashed because it doesn't know about the controller with a function name of example action. So again, I've recreated that code. And I'm going to say paste. Okay, so in here, let's just very quickly revise this. On the router, we are going to accept the post functionality under this path, and we're going to action this controller in here, example action. And that refers to the controller right here, example action. And here we're utilizing the DB query, which is the granularity performance point that I mentioned just a couple of seconds ago. We're going to then use that DB query to enter data directly into the content type of order. And what we're going to see here is that, let me just run this very quickly. What we're going to see is that we've now lost all the goodies that we get from the core router functionality. And that is that we get no validation, enforcement, and also sanitization. So sanitization is one of the things that helps us guard against SQL injections, and this is a default by the Kenix.js library that's used in the background by strapi. So some of the granularity performance that we gain from the DB query also means that we need to enforce some extra security from our behalf. So let's very quickly test this API. And actually, before I do that, let's go to the content type and look at the order. Now, let's quickly put a restriction in here and say required field. And let's say that we don't want any dots, just as we played with on the address content type. So press that, save. So on the core service router that we saw earlier under address, we were automatically given access to those tools by default. Whereas on the background here, when using the DB query, we need to enforce those manually, and we're going to see how that works. So let's go to order. We don't have anything in there at the moment. I'm going to submit this value, and that is forbidden because I haven't given it a AWT token. So let's go to, and I haven't enabled it. So let me just go to order, enable our method, which gives us the order of API order endpoint. Then let's go to order again, and I need to give it a token. So I'm going to borrow it from my address. Again, this is the JWT that we got from logging in from our user. Let's go here, pick bearer token, paste, submit that, and we say we get a response of 200, meaning that we should see something in here now. Okay, there you go. So what do we see? Here, we've submitted a null value with a quantity of 1. And if you recall, on our previous amendment, we actually told that to be of a required field and use the regex pattern. In this case, because we're using the DB query, we lose some of that luxury of having the validation done for us. Okay, so let me just very quickly test this. Cool product. Do those entries, and there you go. So now this means that we have to do a bit of extra work in return for extra performance, and let's see how that works.
This better work.
Now that we're going to be implementing our validation manually, let's go to under your content API, so order, under content types, and under order, create a new file called lifecycle, or lifecycles.js rather. Under that file, we're going to implement the application error, utils from strapi itself, and we're going to also utilize the YAP library, which comes pre-packed with strapi. Our lifecycle hook will then implement that validation on the before create event. So as you can see here, I want to make sure that this happens before the create execution actually kicks off. And we're going to then manually define our validation, just like we were seeing prior on the core router functionality, which comes in already pre-packed. Here we have to have specified. So it doesn't matter what values you put on your content type. For example, this right here. So this would actually be get ignored. And the only way to validate them when using the custom router with controllers is to implement it manually. Okay, so let's now test this. I've told this that it's a required field. It cannot be null, and it must not contain any dots. So just pretty much it matches what we had before. Let's do a send. And in here we get told that it's a string type and it cannot be a null. Now let's put a description in here. We're going to call this the cool product. And we're going to put a dot in there. And now we get told that no periods are allowed. And let's just say that I want to pass a value of text here. Okay, and then we get told that it must be of integer instead of text. And there you have it.
Finally.
So that's how we perform custom validation. There's many ways to actually implement the validation. In this particular scenario, I think that it's a bit cleaner to just keep it as a lifecycle hook. If you start having other requirements, then you might want to consider putting this validation object on a different file and then perform your other functionality within here.
Oh my God, is anybody else falling asleep?
But because we're only validating this for now, it's quite a quick implementation and easy to test. But yes, what we're going to do look at next is the actual sanitization of data that will help us protect against SQL injections by piggybacking of some of the existing libraries within Strapi. So let's go. Okay, so let's now implement our data sanitization from within Strapi. Now, as you can see, I've got a bit of extra light here happening because there's a storm that just rolled in. So let me hurry up before the lights go out on me. Okay, so the way that we're going to do this is by implementing the default sanitization provided by Strapi utils. And in this case, we're going to use sanitize. And before I forget, we are back now on order, controllers, and the controller within orders. My bad. We're back within our controller file. That's what I wanted to say. So what we'll do is very quickly, we're going to define the content type that we need to pass to our sanitization library. And you'll understand why shortly. So let's just keep that here. Copy paste that, the API content type. And then we're going to utilize that content type within our sanitization of that value. And so what we see here is that we are calling our baked-in sanitize utility. We're going to pass it the data from the API where the body is, the content type to then validate the schema and the requirements within that schema, and also the authenticated user. So it needs to be authenticated for it to work. We then are going to get rid of this here, and instead we're going to pass it our sanitized data object. And excuse me. And for the user association, we need to say users permissions user, and we're going to call this cityx state user ID. And let's just very quickly published not new. And again, the new date is just so that it gets published right away. So in case you are dealing with a live production environment and the user needs to have access to this right away, just give it the publish.value, it'll immediately become available. And in here, just in case we've forgotten what this does, it's going to associate the user to the record being inserted as a relation. Let me save that. And I'm not sure if you can hear the thunder, but it's getting pretty bad. I'm going to now, let's go back here. Any orders? No, this is getting empty. Let's do a post, and that seems to have gone through. Reload that, and done. There's our data associated to our user. And now if you were to pull that from the API to the user interface, you will see the association of that data. Now, what we're going to do, sorry, let me just explain what that sanitization did. So this is going to prevent from any SQL injections getting inserted into the database. It will just clean out any malicious attempts and then even reject it at some stages. But I'll try to find an example very quickly. I might have to come back to that, and I'll keep this as is for our next video. But basically, we are sanitizing this particular section for any malicious SQL injections that get handled by the Kenix library in the backend, which is baked in within Strapi. We then implement that in there. We manually assign the user as per the logged in user, and we publish that. Perfect. So this video has actually turned out to be a lot longer than what I thought it was going to be. So what I'll do, as promised, I'll very quickly show on how we can commit a transaction and then roll back from that transaction should anything go wrong. We're going to go into further detail on how that works and actually test it ourselves. But for now, I'll just show you how that gets implemented within what we're seeing at the moment.
Are we there yet? Are we there yet?
I'm going to very quickly show you and implement transactions. We are going to go into further detail on the next video by demonstrating through a file upload and iterating through a whole bunch of data to better test the transaction side of things and rollback. But for now, let's just go through the very basic implementation. So we are going to be able to keep most of our data for the most part. And I'm going to very quickly, for the sake of this video, copy paste from a demonstration that I've created earlier. And also because I do have a very big storm happening in the background that I want to make sure that I give it a miss. So, okay, but let's just go through this very quickly. Get rid of this. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're implementing the default method provided by strapi.db.query. In this case, we're going to use the transaction method. Within the transaction method, we're going to perform our standard entityService creation, and we're going to pass it out sanitized data, just like we were earlier, and also the user permissions and the published. After that transaction is completed, we are going to capture the on commit, which is basically anything that happens after the record gets committed, transacted, and in case anything goes wrong, it will then have a rollback functionality. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to send an email after we commit that transaction. So let's very quickly save this. And I think I've got everything that I need. Now let me go back to orders. We're going to enter something from scratch. Cool, so it's empty. Now let's perform a insert. We get a response. That record is in there. Perfect. And now if we look at our console log down here, what I am hoping to see is the send in. So after our transaction was committed, the on commit, which is the after the transaction occurred, we are then going to send the user an email. Now, from here, you can send and trigger a whole bunch of other workflows, but in this case, we are going to send an email. And as mentioned earlier, we are going to see this in further detail by uploading a large file and then running through transaction commit, and we're going to try to simulate a rollback to see what that looks like. So for now, we've covered a whole bunch. I hope you've stayed on and got some value from this. As previously mentioned, there is more to go on the next set of videos, so please stay put. Mic drop. Right, so we've covered some really core enterprise level essentials. We've looked into how to validate data by utilizing some of the features provided within Strapi. Also, how do we identify and work with authenticated users and level access? And also, how to then commit transactions and roll back from those transactions. On our next video, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper and look at how we interact with different content types, whether it be an API or a plugin, and existing features within Strapi itself. Now, if there are any particular items that you'd like me to cover in the next couple of videos, please comment below and I'll do my best to include them. Apparently, liking and subscribing really helps the channel, so please click there or there, whichever side it will be for you, but I really appreciate it. Until next time, bye.